Welcome to Silent Screams. Tonight, we dive deep into the unknown, into a tale of mystery and terror that unfolds within the seemingly innocent world of cooking. This story, Daz Watches Candys Cooking 2, takes you to the edge of sanity as we explore the terrifying events that unfold behind a kitchen door. So, sit back and let the chills creep up your spine as we begin. It started like any other night. The dim glow of the kitchen lights flickered to life, illuminating the countertops, the stove, the empty chairs. Daz sat at the far end of the room, his eyes glued to the screen in front of him. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just another episode of Candys Cooking show. But there was something different about tonight. A quiet unease filled the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Maybe it was the darkness outside, or maybe it was the strange silence inside the room, but Daz couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Candy was already in the kitchen on screen. She smiled, her usual cheerful expression lighting up the monitor, as if she hadn't a care in the world. She waved at the camera, her movements graceful, yet strangely mechanical. "Hello, my lovely viewers," she said, her voice almost too sweet. "Welcome back to my kitchen. Today, we're making something really special. You won't want to miss this." Her words echoed in the room, but something about the tone seemed off. Daz leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. At first, it was just a little thing. A flicker on the screen, just a glitch, he thought. Maybe the connection was weak. But then the flicker happened again. And again. Each time it came, it lingered a little longer, until the screen seemed to pulse with static. Daz's fingers instinctively reached for the mouse, ready to refresh the page, but before he could, the image stabilized. Candy's face filled the screen once more. But this time, it was different. Her eyes seemed hollow, as if something was staring back at Daz from within her, something dark and cold. Candy smiled wider, if that was even possible. It was too wide, her lips stretching unnaturally. "Let's begin, shall we?" she said, her voice carrying an eerie calmness. Daz's stomach churned. He didn't know why, but something about her smile unsettled him. She turned away from the camera and reached for the ingredients laid out on the counter. The kitchen was ordinary, clean countertops, sharp knives, bowls of fresh vegetables. Nothing that would suggest anything unusual, but as Candy moved, the shadows in the room seemed to shift. The lights overhead flickered again, casting a pale, almost sickly glow over everything. It was subtle at first, like a trick of the light, but then Daz saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the reach of the camera's lens. At first, it was almost imperceptible, just the outline of a person, their shape distorted by the shadows. But as the seconds passed, it became clearer. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, gaunt limbs. Daz froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure stood still, unmoving, as if it was waiting. His breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly raised its head, revealing nothing. No face. No eyes. Just an empty void where a face should have been. Daz felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The figure was hypnotic, its presence too intense to ignore. The kitchen, once bright and clean, began to warp, the walls stretching and groaning as if they were alive. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows pulling in corners where none should be. Candy didn't seem to notice. She was still focused on the ingredients in front of her, chopping vegetables with unnerving precision. The sound of the knife against the cutting board echoed, hollow, as if the very act of cooking had become a ritual, something far more sinister than it appeared. Suddenly, Candy stopped. The knife hovered in midair. Daz's breath hitched as he saw her eyes dart to the side, just for a moment. Her smile faltered, just slightly, and then she resumed, as if nothing had happened. But Daz knew, he knew something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. The figure had moved. It was closer now, standing at the far side of the kitchen, its form even more twisted than before. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, as if it were drawing energy from the room itself. Candy continued to chop, but the vegetables on the counter weren't normal. Daz's eyes widened as he watched them slowly shift. The carrots, once orange and fresh, began to darken, curling at the edges. The potatoes started to sprout something, tiny tendrils, like roots, reaching for the counter. And then, the most chilling thing of all, the knife. The blade twisted in midair, bending as if it were made of rubber, stretching and contorting in impossible directions. Daz's heart raced. He couldn't take his eyes off the screen, but he couldn't look either. His mind was screaming at him to turn away, but his body wouldn't respond. He wanted to reach for his phone, to call someone, to make it stop. But he couldn't move. The kitchen was no longer just a kitchen. It was a place of madness, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a sense of dread. The temperature seemed to drop, but Daz's skin was slick with sweat. He could hear something now. A whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. It was coming from the shadows, coming from the figure that still stood in the corner, waiting. The voice was soft, barely audible, but the words were clear. "She sees you," it said. "She knows you're watching." The sound of the knife against the cutting board suddenly stopped. Candy's head snapped around, her eyes now completely black, voids where there should have been pupils. "I see you too, Daz," she whispered, her voice cold and distant. "You shouldn't have watched." Before Daz could react, the screen flickered once more. The lights in the kitchen dimmed, casting long shadows across the room. Candy wasn't there anymore. In her place stood the figure, now fully formed. It had no face, just a gaping hole where its head should have been. And it was staring straight at Daz. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around him. "It's too late," the voice hissed. "You can't leave." Daz scrambled for the mouse, his hands shaking as he clicked the mouse furiously, trying to close the video, to escape. But the screen wouldn't respond. It was stuck, frozen on the image of that faceless figure, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. Suddenly, a sharp, painful jolt shot through Daz's body, as if an electric current had passed through him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went black. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his room. He was in the kitchen. The air was thick, the walls stretching and warping like rubber. The floor beneath him was slick, cold, and wet. He could hear the sound of something breathing nearby, shallow and ragged. Daz slowly turned his head. And there she was. Candy. But this wasn't the same Candy he had been watching moments ago. This Candy was different, her skin pale, her eyes black and hollow. Her mouth stretched into that same twisted, unnatural smile. "You shouldn't have watched," she whispered, taking a step closer. "Now you're part of the recipe." Daz opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His body wouldn't move, his limbs frozen, trapped in the nightmare he had unwillingly entered. He was in her world now, and there was no escape. The last thing Daz saw was the gleam of the knife in Candy's hand as it came toward him, the light above flickering violently, casting shadows that seemed to dance with life.